Welcome to our channel, where we explore the quiet, often forgotten corners of history. Tonight we begin a long journey into Victorian London, a city of extreme contrasts, where unimaginable wealth and crushing poverty existed side by side. This story will slowly reveal where the rich lived, where the poor struggled to survive, and how invisible boundaries shaped everyday life in one of the most powerful cities the world had ever seen. As the gas lamps flicker and the streets grow quiet, we'll walk through elegant avenues and dark alleyways alike, uncovering a city divided not by walls but by class, money, and opportunity. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video if you enjoy slow, immersive history made for rest and reflection. And let us know in the comments from which location you're watching, whether it's late at night or early morning. We love reading where our listeners are drifting in from around the world. Victorian London was not one city, but many cities layered on top of one another. To a visitor arriving in the mid-19th century, London appeared vast and unstoppable. Its skyline was filled with church spires, factory chimneys, and rows of tightly packed houses stretching farther than the eye could see. Horse-drawn carriages rattled across cobbled streets, while riverboats crowded the Thames. Yet behind this spectacle lay a harsh truth. Where you lived in London determined almost everything about your life, your health, your safety, your future, and even how long you were likely to live. The wealthy lived in wide streets, lined with elegant townhouses, especially in areas like the West End. Neighborhoods such as Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington were carefully planned, clean, and orderly. These districts featured grand homes built of stone and brick, with tall windows, iron railings, and polished front doors. Inside, rooms were spacious, warmed by fireplaces, and lit by chandeliers or oil lamps. Servants moved quietly through back staircases, ensuring that life for the wealthy remained comfortable and undisturbed. In these districts, the air felt different. Streets were swept regularly, waste was removed, and sewage systems, though still imperfect, were far better maintained than elsewhere in the city. Trees lined the roads, parks were nearby, and the noise of factories was kept at a distance. For the rich, London was a place of culture and refinement. They attended theaters, concerts, dinner parties, and balls. Children were educated at home or sent to prestigious schools, shielded from the harsh realities only a few miles away. Yet just a short walk or carriage ride from these refined streets, the city transformed completely. As one moved eastward, the houses grew smaller, the streets narrower, and the smell heavier. This was East London, home to the working poor, where entire families crowded into single rooms. In districts like Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Bethnal Green, poverty shaped every aspect of daily life. Buildings were old, damp, and crumbling. Many homes lacked running water or proper toilets. Waste flowed openly through gutters, and the air was thick with smoke from factories and coal fires. The poor lived where rent was cheapest, even if it meant danger. Landlords often divided houses into multiple tiny rooms, renting each one to a different family. These tenements were overcrowded beyond imagination. In some cases, 6 or more people slept in one small room, sharing a single bed or taking turns sleeping. Disease spread rapidly in such conditions, and outbreaks of cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis were common. The poor did not choose these neighborhoods out of preference. They lived there because they had nowhere else to go. Class separation in Victorian London was not accidental. The city's layout reflected deep social beliefs about wealth, morality, and worth. The rich believed poverty was a moral failing, and many preferred to keep the poor out of sight. This led to a physical separation of communities. Wide roads, railway lines, and commercial districts often acted as invisible borders between rich and poor neighborhoods. Crossing from one side to the other felt like entering an entirely different world. The River Thames itself symbolized this divide. While wealthy Londoners enjoyed river views from clean embankments and bridges, the poor depended on the river for work and survival. Dock workers, boatmen, and laborers lived close to the docks in overcrowded housing, exposed to pollution and danger. The river carried waste, sewage, and industrial runoff, making it both a lifeline and a health hazard. For the rich, the Thames was scenery. For the poor, it was survival. Transportation also reinforced inequality. The wealthy traveled in private carriages, or later by train, allowing them to live farther from their workplaces in cleaner areas. The poor walked everywhere. Long journeys to factories, docks, or markets consumed hours each day, leaving little time for rest. This meant the poor had to live close to their work, often near noisy, polluted industrial zones where housing was cheapest, but conditions were worst. Children born into these areas inherited their surroundings. A child raised in Belgravia grew up surrounded by books, tutors, and opportunity. A child born in Whitechapel grew up surrounded by hunger, labor, and danger. These neighborhoods shaped expectations early. For the poor, survival came before education. Many children worked from a young age, contributing to household income through factory labor, street selling, or domestic service. Where a child lived often decided the course of their entire life. Despite the hardship, poor communities were not without resilience. Neighbors relied on one another for support, sharing food, information, and protection. Streets were alive with human activity, vendors shouting, children playing, workers returning home late at night. Life was harsh, but it was also deeply communal. In contrast, wealthy districts were quieter, more private, and socially controlled. Doors closed early, and interactions were formal and limited. Victorian London thrived on this imbalance. The labor of the poor powered the comfort of the rich. Factories, docks, railways, and workshops relied on workers who lived in the most deprived districts. Yet those workers rarely benefited from the wealth they helped create. The city grew richer, but the divide between neighborhoods grew deeper. As night fell over London, gas lamps illuminated only certain streets. In wealthy areas, they cast a warm, steady glow. In poor districts, darkness lingered longer, broken only by flickering lights from pubs or factories working through the night. Safety, like comfort, depended on where you lived. By the middle of the Victorian era, London had become the largest city in the world, both in population and influence. Its expansion was rapid and relentless, pulling people from rural villages and foreign lands into its crowded streets. Yet this growth did not happen evenly. While the wealthy retreated into carefully designed neighborhoods, the poor were compressed into ever smaller spaces, forced to adapt to conditions that grew worse with each passing year. In the West End, architecture reflected power and permanence. Townhouses were built in uniform rows, designed to project stability and elegance. Each home had multiple floors, separating public and private life. Drawing rooms were placed on the first floor to receive guests, while bedrooms sat above, removed from street noise. Kitchens and servant quarters were tucked away below ground or at the back of the house, keeping labor invisible. These buildings were symbols of order, hierarchy, and control. In stark contrast, housing for the poor was chaotic and improvised. Many buildings in East London had been constructed centuries earlier, never intended to hold so many people. As the population grew, landlords subdivided homes again and again. Hallways became bedrooms. Cellars became living spaces, even though they flooded regularly with sewage-tainted water. In some areas, entire families lived underground, receiving little light or fresh air. One of the most infamous forms of housing for the poor was the lodging house. These establishments offered beds by the night, sometimes by the hour. For a few pennies, a person could sleep in a shared room packed with strangers. Some lodging houses were so overcrowded that ropes were strung across rooms, allowing people to lean forward and sleep standing up. Privacy did not exist. Safety was uncertain. Yet for many, these places were the only alternative to sleeping on the streets. The streets themselves became living spaces for the poorest Londoners. Those without money for rent slept under bridges, in doorways, or along alleyways. Entire communities formed among the homeless, creating their own rules and support systems. Street life was dangerous, especially at night, but it also offered a strange sense of freedom for those who had nowhere else to go. Wealthier Londoners often avoided these districts entirely. Newspapers described them as dangerous, immoral, and diseased. Fear of crime and illness reinforced social separation. Many believed that simply entering poor neighborhoods posed a risk to health and reputation. This fear allowed conditions to worsen unchecked, as long as they remained out of sight. Public health became a growing concern as epidemics spread across class boundaries. Cholera outbreaks revealed that disease did not respect social divisions. Even the wealthy could not fully escape the consequences of overcrowded slums. Slowly, this realization led to calls for reform, yet early improvements were limited and uneven, often focused more on protecting wealthy areas than improving poor ones. Infrastructure followed wealth. Clean water, sewers, paved roads, and lighting were introduced first in affluent districts. Poor neighborhoods waited years, sometimes decades, for the same improvements. Even when changes arrived, they were often poorly executed or insufficient for the population density. As a result, inequality became built into the city itself. Employment tied people to place. Dock workers lived near docks. Factory workers lived near factories. Domestic servants often lived inside wealthy homes, sleeping in attics or basements, separated physically and socially from their employers, despite sharing the same building. This created strange overlaps, extreme wealth and extreme poverty under one roof, yet worlds apart. Children navigated these spaces differently. Wealthy children played in private gardens and parks. Poor children claimed the streets as their playgrounds, learning early how to avoid danger, earn money, and survive. These streets taught lessons no school ever would. As London continued to expand outward, suburbs began to form for the middle and upper classes. Railways allowed those with money to escape the city center entirely, leaving behind the poorest residents. This outward movement deepened inner-city poverty, concentrating hardship in specific districts. The physical map of Victorian London became a social map. Every street told a story of class, power, and survival. Where you lived shaped how others saw you and how you saw yourself. And as we move further into this story, we will see how these divided spaces affected crime, family life, and the daily rhythms of survival in a city that never truly slept. As Victorian London pressed forward into the later decades of the 19th century, the divide between where the rich and poor lived became not just visible, but deeply entrenched. The city no longer merely reflected inequality, it enforced it. Entire neighborhoods carried reputations that followed their residents wherever they went. An address could determine whether a person was trusted, feared, ignored, or welcomed. To live in a certain street was to carry its stigma or prestige like a permanent mark. In wealthy districts, daily life unfolded with a sense of predictability and control. Streets were wide enough for carriages to pass comfortably, and pavements were kept clean. Police patrols were frequent, ensuring order and discouraging crime. Shops sold luxury goods, tailored clothing, fine china, imported foods, items far beyond the reach of the working poor. Social life revolved around formal visits, scheduled events, and private gatherings. Even leisure was structured, occurring in theaters, clubs, and manicured parks designed to exclude those who did not belong. Meanwhile, in the poorest districts, life followed a different rhythm entirely. Streets were narrow and crowded, often clogged with people, animals, carts, and refuse. The smell of waste, smoke, and unwashed bodies lingered in the air. Noise never truly faded. Factories operated late into the night. Taverns spilled music and shouting into the streets, and arguments echoed through thin walls. Privacy was almost non-existent, and survival required constant awareness of one's surroundings. Crime flourished where poverty concentrated, not necessarily because the poor were more criminal, but because desperation left few alternatives. Pickpocketing, petty theft, and street scams were common, especially in overcrowded areas where anonymity was easy. Children learned early how to navigate these dangers, both as potential victims and, sometimes, as participants. For many, crime was not a moral choice but a practical one, shaped by hunger and lack of opportunity. Policing reflected class bias. In wealthy areas, the police were protectors. In poor districts, they were often viewed with suspicion or fear. Arrests were frequent, and punishment was harsh. A minor offense in a slum could result in imprisonment, while similar behavior in affluent areas might be overlooked. This uneven enforcement deepened resentment and reinforced the belief that the law existed to protect property rather than people. Housing conditions continued to deteriorate as London's population surged. New arrivals, immigrants, rural laborers, and displaced families poured into already overcrowded neighborhoods. With little regulation, landlords prioritized profit over safety. Buildings were rarely repaired, roofs leaked, walls cracked, and staircases collapsed. Fires were common and devastating, spreading quickly through tightly packed wooden structures. When disaster struck, the poor had nowhere else to go. Some reformers began to document these conditions, walking through slums and recording what they saw. Their reports shocked those who had never ventured beyond the comfort of the West End. Descriptions of families living alongside rats, children sleeping on bare floors, and entire streets without access to clean water challenged the belief that poverty was simply a result of laziness. Yet awareness did not always lead to action. Many preferred to believe that such suffering was unavoidable, or worse, deserved. Work dictated where people lived, and work itself was changing. Industrial employment was unstable. Factories closed suddenly, docks hired by the day, and illness could mean instant unemployment. Without savings, missing even a few days of work could result in eviction. This constant insecurity kept families trapped in cheap housing, unable to move even when conditions became unbearable. Women faced particular challenges shaped by geography. In wealthy districts, women managed households, supervised servants, and raised children within sheltered environments. In poor areas, women often worked long hours in factories, laundries, or as street vendors, while also caring for children and maintaining households. Many took in laundry or sewing work to supplement income. Some turned to prostitution, especially in districts where poverty was most severe. These neighborhoods became known not just for deprivation, but for moral judgment imposed by outsiders. Children's experiences were defined by their surroundings. In affluent areas, childhood was increasingly seen as a protected stage of life, filled with education, play, and preparation for adulthood. In poor districts, childhood was brief. Children contributed economically as soon as they were able, whether by working, begging, or caring for siblings. Streets became classrooms, teaching lessons of resilience, caution, and endurance. Religious institutions played different roles across the city. In wealthy neighborhoods, churches were social centers, reinforcing status and respectability. In poor areas, missions and charitable organizations provided food, shelter, and sometimes education. These institutions often stood as rare places of refuge. Yet even charity carried conditions, offering help alongside strict moral expectations. Assistance could be withdrawn if recipients failed to meet standards set by those who had never lived their hardships. Despite everything, poor communities developed their own forms of strength. Neighbors watched over each other's children, shared meals when possible, and passed along information about work opportunities. Informal networks replaced the support systems the city failed to provide. These bonds did not eliminate suffering, but they made it survivable. The physical separation between rich and poor grew more deliberate as the century progressed. Urban planning favored wealth. New roads and developments pushed slums farther from view, isolating poverty rather than addressing it. Railways cut through neighborhoods, displacing residents without compensation. While the city modernized, many of its poorest inhabitants were simply moved aside. Public debates about housing reform began to emerge, driven by fears of disease, unrest, and moral decay. Some recognized that neglecting entire sections of the city posed risks to everyone. Early efforts to improve housing focused on demolition rather than rehabilitation, destroying slums without providing adequate alternatives. This often worsened homelessness, forcing families into even tighter spaces elsewhere. As London approached the end of the Victorian era, the map of the city told a silent story of inequality. The grand avenues and hidden alleys existed within the same city limits, yet might as well have been worlds apart. Daily life unfolded according to geography, shaping behavior, expectations, and futures. The place where one lived was not simply an address, it was destiny. And as the city continued to grow and reform slowly stirred These divided spaces would play a crucial role in shaping public policy, social movements, and the struggles that lay ahead, as Victorian London stood on the edge of a new century, still burdened by the shadows of its own design. As the Victorian era moved toward its later years, the boundaries between rich and poor neighborhoods in London became not only physical but psychological. People learned early which streets to avoid, which accents to hide, and which addresses to never mention aloud. Reputation clung to place. A man from Mayfair was assumed respectable before he spoke a word. A woman from Whitechapel was judged long before she explained herself. These assumptions shaped opportunity, trust, and fear, reinforcing a city divided by invisible lines. Daily routines reflected this divide in subtle but powerful ways. In wealthy districts, mornings began quietly. Servants rose early to light fires, prepare breakfast, and open curtains, allowing the household to wake into comfort. Deliveries arrived punctually. Fresh bread, milk, newspapers, brought by workers who would never live nearby. Children were dressed carefully and escorted to lessons or tutors, their futures mapped out years in advance. Time felt abundant, structured, and predictable. In poorer districts, mornings arrived with urgency. Families woke before dawn, often after restless nights interrupted by noise, cold, or hunger. There was no time for preparation beyond necessity. A quick meal, if one could be afforded, and then the rush to work began. Mothers carried infants, while older children were sent into the streets to earn what they could. Fathers searched for day labor, uncertain whether wages would come at all. Time here was scarce and fragile, measured not by clocks, but by survival. The design of the city reinforced these rhythms. Wealthy areas had access to green spaces, parks where residents could walk, breathe cleaner air, and escape the press of urban life. These parks were carefully maintained, monitored, and, in practice, exclusive. Poor districts had few such spaces. Streets doubled as playgrounds, marketplaces, and gathering places. Children played beside open drains. Conversations took place in doorways and alleys. Life unfolded publicly, leaving little room for rest or retreat. Education followed geography. Schools in affluent areas were well-funded, orderly, and focused on refinement as much as instruction. Discipline was strict but purposeful, designed to mold future leaders. In poor areas, schools were overcrowded or non-existent. Many children attended irregularly, pulled out whenever money was needed. Education was seen as a luxury, valuable but impractical when hunger was immediate. This gap widened over generations, ensuring that social mobility remained rare. Health outcomes reflected living conditions. Wealthy families could afford doctors, rest, and clean environments. Illness was inconvenient, but rarely fatal. In poor districts, disease was constant. Minor injuries became serious infections. Contagion spread quickly through crowded homes. Life expectancy was drastically lower, and death was a familiar presence. Funerals passed through streets weekly, sometimes daily, reinforcing a quiet acceptance of loss. The press played a role in shaping perceptions of these neighborhoods. Newspapers often sensationalized slums, portraying them as breeding grounds of vice and danger. Stories emphasized crime and disorder, rarely addressing the structural causes behind them. This portrayal justified neglect and reinforced fear. Few articles explored the lives of the poor with empathy. Instead, distance was maintained, allowing the wealthy to view suffering as something separate from themselves. Charity became one of the few bridges between classes, though it was uneven and conditional. Philanthropic organizations distributed food, clothing, and shelter, often concentrated in the most desperate districts. Yet charity rarely addressed long-term needs. Aid was temporary, controlled, and moralized. Recipients were expected to demonstrate gratitude and obedience. While some lives were eased, the underlying inequalities remained untouched. Women in poor districts bore the weight of these conditions heavily. They managed households under impossible circumstances, stretched resources beyond reason, and endured constant stress. Many worked outside the home, returning late to care for children and maintain living spaces that offered little comfort. Their labor was invisible to much of society, yet essential. In contrast, women in wealthy areas managed comfort, rather than scarcity. Supported by servants and social networks that protected them from the city's harsher realities, the streets themselves told stories of division. In the West End, shops displayed luxury behind polished glass. In the East End, goods spilled onto pavements, used clothing, cheap food, tools sold secondhand. Markets thrived where regulation was light, filling gaps left by formal systems. These informal economies sustained entire communities. Even as authorities viewed them with suspicion, transportation reinforced separation. Omnibuses and later trains allowed the wealthy to travel without interacting with poorer neighborhoods. Routes were designed to serve commercial and affluent districts first. For the poor, walking remained the primary means of movement, limiting access to opportunities elsewhere in the city. Distance became another barrier, quietly maintaining inequality. As reform movements gained momentum, debates about housing intensified. Some argued that improving living conditions would uplift the poor. Others feared that better housing would encourage dependency or moral decline. Progress was slow, compromised by politics and prejudice. Early housing projects often displaced residents without offering real alternatives, fracturing communities that had survived through mutual support. Children growing up in these environments absorbed these realities without explanation. They learned which streets were safe, which faces could be trusted, and how to move unnoticed. Their understanding of the city was intimate and practical, shaped by necessity rather than privilege. This knowledge, though invaluable, came at the cost of innocence. Despite all this, hope persisted quietly. People adapted, resisted, and endured. Small improvements, cleaner water in one street, a new schoolroom, a charitable kitchen were celebrated. Change, when it came, arrived slowly and unevenly, but it arrived because people refused to disappear quietly. As London approached the turn of the century, pressure mounted for deeper reform. The stark contrast between neighborhoods could no longer be ignored entirely. The city had grown too large, too connected, for inequality to remain hidden forever. The spaces where people lived had shaped generations, and those shapes were now influencing politics, public health, and social thought. And as these forces gathered strength, Victorian London stood at a threshold, still divided by wealth and poverty, yet beginning, almost imperceptibly, to question whether such divisions could endure unchanged into the future. As the 19th century edged closer to its end, Victorian London existed in a state of contradiction. It was a city celebrated as the heart of a global empire, yet sustained by neighborhoods that lived in constant deprivation. The geography of wealth and poverty was no longer accidental or temporary. It had become institutional. Streets, buildings, and entire districts were shaped by decisions that favored some lives over others, embedding inequality into brick and stone. In affluent areas, homes continued to grow more elaborate. Renovations modernized interiors with improved plumbing, gas lighting, and later, electricity. These advancements were introduced first, where money already flowed, reinforcing comfort and safety. The wealthy experienced progress as convenience, barely noticing the systems that supported it. Servants managed waste, coal deliveries, and household maintenance, ensuring that life remained orderly and uninterrupted. In contrast, the poor lived with progress as disruption. Infrastructure projects designed to modernize the city often cut directly through working-class neighborhoods. Roads widened, railways expanded, and buildings were demolished, pushing residents into even tighter spaces. Compensation was rare, relocation unsupported. Families displaced by improvements found themselves further east, further south, or deeper into already crowded streets, carrying their lives with them in bundles and sacks. These disruptions weakened community bonds that had taken decades to form. Streets that once provided mutual support vanished overnight. People who relied on neighbors for childcare, food sharing, or informal work were scattered. While reformers spoke of sanitation and order, the human cost of these changes went largely unacknowledged. Employment opportunities remained tied to geography. Docklands, factories, and workshops anchored people to specific districts. Even when wages were barely enough to survive, workers stayed close to their livelihoods because travel was costly and time-consuming. This tethering ensured that poverty remained concentrated, reproducing itself within the same streets generation after generation. Housing reform became a subject of debate rather than action. Model dwellings were constructed, often presented as solutions to slum conditions. These buildings offered cleaner environments and better layouts, but rents were frequently higher than what the poorest could afford. As a result, those most in need were excluded. The very people meant to benefit were left behind, watching improvements pass them by. Social attitudes hardened. Many in wealthier districts viewed poverty as inevitable or self-inflicted. Distance made empathy abstract. Charity was praised, but structural change was resisted. Helping the poor was acceptable, but living near them was not. This mindset influenced urban planning, zoning, and policy, ensuring continued separation between classes. Children growing up in poor districts inherited these realities with little explanation. They learned the boundaries of the city through experience. Certain streets promised work, others promised danger. Some areas felt unreachable, existing only in stories or glimpses from afar. These children developed resilience early, but that resilience came at the cost of opportunity. Women, especially widows and single mothers, faced constant precarity. Housing insecurity loomed over every illness, every missed wage. Landlords held power with few restrictions. Evictions were swift, often executed with little warning. Possessions were left in the street, families scrambling to find shelter. The city offered no safety net, only temporary relief from overstretched charities. Nightfall deepened contrasts. In wealthy areas, homes glowed warmly behind curtains. Streets quieted, protected by patrols and lighting. In poorer districts, night intensified hardship. Work continued late. Taverns overflowed with those seeking warmth or escape. Crime rose, not from malice alone, but from desperation sharpened by darkness. Despite this, cultural life flourished in unexpected ways. Music halls, street performances, and informal gatherings provided relief from relentless strain. Storytelling, humor, and shared rituals sustained morale. These expressions rarely crossed class boundaries, remaining rooted in local communities, unseen by those who lived elsewhere. The city's political landscape began to shift under the weight of these divisions. Public health crises forced acknowledgement that neglect carried consequences. Disease spread beyond slums. Labor unrest disrupted commerce. Gradually, conversations about responsibilities surfaced. Still, progress lagged behind need, slowed by resistance and fear of change. Transportation improvements continued to benefit the middle and upper classes disproportionately. Suburban expansion allowed those with means to escape the city center entirely. This outward movement drained resources and attention from inner districts, further isolating the poor. London expanded outward while its core hardened. Maps of the city told a quiet truth. Wealth clustered westward and outward. Poverty pressed inward and eastward. These patterns were discussed in reports, debated in meetings, and then largely preserved. The city functioned efficiently because inequality kept it so. Yet beneath this rigid structure, dissatisfaction grew. Voices emerged demanding better housing, fair wages, and public accountability. These voices often originated within poor communities themselves, shaped by lived experience rather than theory. Change, when it came, would not arrive gently. As the Victorian era prepared to give way to a new century, London stood divided but restless. The spaces where people lived had shaped their lives for decades. Those spaces now began to shape the future of the city itself, setting the stage for conflict, reform, and transformation still to come. And as these pressures mounted quietly beneath the surface, the city continued its endless motion. Carriages rolling, factories humming, families enduring, unaware that the geography of their lives was about to face its most serious challenge yet. As the turn of the century approached, Victorian London stood heavy with the weight of its own contradictions. The physical separation between rich and poor neighborhoods had shaped not only daily life, but the collective conscience of the city. What once felt permanent now began to feel unstable. The same streets that carried wealth outward also carried discontent inward, and the imbalance that had defined London for decades could no longer exist without consequence. In wealthy districts, comfort continued largely uninterrupted. Households adopted new technologies with ease. Indoor plumbing, improved heating, and better lighting arrived quietly, blending into everyday life. These advances made homes healthier and more secure, further insulating residents from the hardships elsewhere. Distance, both physical and emotional, allowed many to believe that progress was universal, that the city as a whole was moving forward together. But in poorer areas, change arrived unevenly and often painfully. Improvements to sanitation and housing were discussed far more than they were delivered. When action did come, it was frequently disruptive. Entire streets were demolished in the name of public health, forcing residents to relocate with little notice or support. Families already struggling were uprooted again, pushed deeper into overcrowded districts where rents rose and space shrank further. The language of reform often failed to include the voices of those most affected. Plans were drawn by officials who rarely visited the neighborhoods they sought to redesign. Solutions emphasized order and efficiency over stability and community. The poor were treated as a problem to be managed, rather than people to be supported. This disconnect deepened mistrust between classes and fueled growing resentment. Work remained central to survival, yet employment grew more uncertain. Mechanization reduced the need for manual labor in some industries, while competition for jobs intensified in others. Casual work dominated the lives of many, offering no guarantees. 1 week of steady wages could be followed by weeks of unemployment. Housing insecurity mirrored this instability, with families constantly at risk of displacement. Children felt these pressures acutely. Many grew up moving from one street to another, rarely settling long enough to form lasting ties. School attendance remained inconsistent, interrupted by work, illness, or eviction. Childhood, already brief, became fragmented. Yet children adapted quickly, learning how to read their environments, how to navigate danger, and how to contribute to survival in whatever way they could. Public concern over these conditions slowly intensified. Reports, photographs, and testimonies brought the realities of slum life into wider view. Middle-class reformers began visiting poor districts, documenting what they saw. Some were motivated by compassion, others by fear of unrest. Regardless of motive, attention increased, and with it, pressure for meaningful change. Housing reform became a central focus. New ideas emerged about responsibility and public investment. The notion that decent living conditions were a public good, not merely a private concern, gained ground, yet implementation remained cautious. Funding was limited. Resistance persisted. Many feared that improving conditions would undermine social order or encourage dependency. At the same time, the city's population continued to shift. Immigration brought new communities into already crowded areas. These newcomers often settled where rents were lowest, adding cultural diversity but also intensifying competition for housing and work. Tensions arose, shaped by scarcity rather than difference alone. The city became more complex, layered with overlapping struggles. Wealthy areas, meanwhile, began to retreat further from the city center. Suburban living expanded, supported by railways and trams. Those with means increasingly chose distance over proximity, reducing contact with inner-city poverty. This withdrawal drained political urgency from reform efforts, allowing conditions in poor districts to persist largely unchanged. Yet the city could not fully escape itself. Public health crises continued to expose interdependence. Disease traveled across boundaries. Labor strikes disrupted supply chains. Crime, born of desperation, affected commerce and security. The separation that once protected wealth now proved incomplete. Women in poor neighborhoods remained pillars of resilience. They managed households through uncertainty, maintained social ties, and carried emotional burdens quietly. Their labor sustained families and communities, though it remained largely invisible to official records. In wealthy areas, women increasingly participated in reform movements, advocating for housing, health, and education, often without fully grasping the daily realities they sought to change. Cultural narratives about poverty began to shift slightly. Literature, journalism, and public discourse started to reflect complexity rather than caricature. Stories of endurance, not just failure, reached wider audiences. This shift did not immediately alter conditions, but it softened some assumptions and opened space for dialogue. By the final years of the Victorian era, London felt poised between endurance and transformation. The geography of inequality had shaped generations, but it was no longer unquestioned. The city's vast scale made change slow, but momentum was building beneath the surface. Streets remained crowded, homes remained unequal, lives continued along familiar paths. Yet beneath routine, expectations were shifting. The idea that where one lived should determine one's worth began to weaken, challenged by experience, exposure, and necessity. As the old century prepared to close, London carried its divisions forward, but also its lessons. The spaces that separated rich and poor had revealed the cost of neglect and the limits of distance. What came next would be shaped by whether the city chose to preserve those divisions or finally confront them. And as night fell once more over its rooftops and alleyways, the city rested uneasily, carrying within it both the weight of its past and the uncertain promise of what lay ahead. As the Victorian era drew closer to its end, London's divisions became impossible to ignore. Even for those who had spent their lives insulated from them, the city was no longer just expanding outward. It was pressing inward, forcing questions that could not be answered with distance alone. The places where people lived had created a social map that governed behavior, expectation, and fate. This map, once accepted as natural, now appeared increasingly fragile. In poorer districts, daily life continued with relentless intensity. Families woke each morning unsure of what the day would bring. Employment remained unstable, and wages rarely kept pace with rising rents. A single setback, a lost job, an illness, a landlord's decision could unravel everything. Housing insecurity became a constant companion, shaping decisions large and small. People learned not to accumulate possessions they might have to abandon quickly. Life was lived lightly, not by choice, but by necessity. Neighborhoods adapted to this instability in practical ways. Informal systems of support developed, built on trust and familiarity rather than contracts. Landladies allowed late payments when possible. Neighbors shared childcare or meals. Information about work opportunities passed quickly from door to door. These systems were fragile, but they sustained communities where official systems failed to reach. In wealthy areas, life remained shielded from such uncertainty. Residents benefited from predictability, steady incomes, secure housing, and access to services that responded quickly to need. This stability allowed long-term planning. Futures could be imagined with confidence. Children were prepared for roles that mirrored their parents' status, reinforcing continuity across generations. The physical landscape reinforced these differences. New buildings in affluent districts were designed with permanence in mind. Materials were durable, layouts spacious. In contrast, housing for the poor remained temporary in spirit, even when constructed of brick. Repairs were minimal. Investment was cautious. Buildings were seen as expendable, reflecting the way their occupants were viewed. Public discourse increasingly framed poverty as a problem of environment rather than character. This shift was subtle but significant. The recognition that living conditions shaped behavior and health began to influence thinking. Reformers argued that overcrowding, not moral weakness, produced crime and illness. This perspective challenged long-held beliefs and threatened the comfort of simple explanations. Still, resistance was strong. Many feared that acknowledging structural causes would require structural solutions that might redistribute resources or alter power. Debates stalled. Progress came in fragments. Improvements were localized, incremental, and often symbolic. Transportation continued to shape opportunity. Railways and trams expanded access for those who could afford fares, while the poorest remained confined to walking distance. This confinement limited job prospects and reinforced neighborhood isolation. The city grew more connected, yet those connections were unevenly accessible. Children growing up in poor districts developed a complex understanding of these boundaries. They knew which streets offered opportunity and which promised trouble. They learned to navigate authority carefully, to appear compliant when necessary and invisible when possible. These skills were survival tools, though they carried long-term consequences for confidence and trust. Education reform progressed slowly. Attendance improved in some areas, but overcrowding and underfunding limited effectiveness. Schools reflected their neighborhoods, struggling where poverty was greatest. Yet even limited education offered moments of escape, windows into worlds beyond immediate surroundings. For some children, these moments planted seeds that would later grow into demands for change. Women remained central to the fabric of poor communities. Their labor, emotional and physical, held families together under immense pressure. They negotiated with landlords, managed scarce resources, and provided care across generations. Their strength rarely entered public narratives, yet without it, entire neighborhoods would have collapsed. In affluent areas, some women increasingly engaged in reform efforts, visiting poor districts, organizing charities, and advocating for housing improvements. They bridged social divides cautiously. These encounters were often shaped by misunderstanding, but they also introduced empathy into spaces long dominated by distance. The city's institutions began to respond, if unevenly. Local councils experimented with housing initiatives. Health boards expanded sanitation efforts. These actions signaled recognition, though not resolution. Implementation lagged behind rhetoric, constrained by funding, politics, and hesitation. Cultural life continued to reflect division. Entertainment in wealthy areas emphasized refinement and exclusivity. In poorer districts, culture was communal and improvised. Music, storytelling, shared rituals that required little beyond participation. These expressions sustained identity and dignity, even as external judgment dismissed them. As the Victorian age neared its close, London existed in a state of tension between endurance and transformation. The old order persisted, but cracks were visible. The geography of inequality had shaped generations. Yet it was no longer beyond question. The city's future depended on whether these questions would lead to meaningful change or be absorbed into familiar patterns of delay. For now, life continued much as before. Streets remained crowded. Homes remained unequal. Lives unfolded along paths defined by place. Yet beneath routine, something had shifted. Awareness had spread. Expectations had changed. The idea that the city could remain divided without consequence was fading. And as London moved toward a new century, carrying its burdens forward, the places where people lived continued to tell their stories of endurance, exclusion, and the quiet insistence that space, like society, could be reshaped. As the 19th century finally gave way to the 20th, Victorian London stood transformed, yet unresolved. The city had grown larger, richer, and more complex than anyone could have imagined at the start of the era. But beneath its expanding streets and rising buildings, the question of where people lived and why remained at the heart of everything. The long-standing divide between rich and poor neighborhoods had shaped not only daily life, but the moral landscape of the city itself. For decades, the wealthy had lived buffered from hardship, protected by distance, infrastructure, and influence. Their homes stood as symbols of permanence and privilege, built to last and designed to comfort. These neighborhoods benefited first from every improvement the city offered: cleaner water, better sanitation, safer streets. Progress arrived quietly and stayed. Life here felt stable, predictable, and secure. For the poor, life had been defined by uncertainty. Homes were temporary in spirit, even when made of brick. Streets were crowded, loud, and often unsafe. Entire families lived at the mercy of landlords, employers, and illness. A single disruption could dismantle everything. These neighborhoods carried the weight of the city's labor, yet received the least protection from its systems. Survival depended on adaptability, resilience, and community bonds forged under pressure. By the end of the Victorian era, however, something subtle but important had changed. The suffering of the poor could no longer be dismissed as invisible. Reports, investigations, and lived experience had exposed the consequences of neglect. Disease, unrest, and inequality had proven that separation did not mean insulation. The city had learned, slowly and reluctantly, that its divisions affected everyone. Housing reform, though incomplete, had begun to reshape thinking. The idea that decent living conditions were a shared responsibility gained cautious acceptance. Some new housing projects offered safer environments, even if they failed to reach those most in need. Public health initiatives expanded, acknowledging that clean water and sanitation were necessities rather than luxuries. These steps were small, but they marked a shift in attitude. Education reform, too, began to alter the future. More children attended school regularly, gaining skills their parents never had access to. While poverty still limited opportunity, knowledge created possibility. The rigid certainty that a child's life would mirror their surroundings weakened slightly. Hope entered spaces where it had long been absent. The city itself evolved. Transportation expanded, connecting neighborhoods in new ways. Communication increased. The flow of people and ideas blurred some boundaries, even as others remained. The stark geography of wealth and poverty softened at the edges, though it did not disappear. London remained unequal, but it was no longer unquestioned. Communities carried forward their lessons. In poor districts, resilience and cooperation endured. People who had survived the worst conditions brought with them an understanding of mutual dependence. In wealthier areas, awareness grew, uneven and incomplete, but present. The notion that comfort came without cost became harder to maintain. The legacy of Victorian London's divided neighborhoods lived on into the new century. The patterns established during those years continued to influence housing, policy, and opportunity. Streets remembered their past. Buildings carried stories in their walls. Lives unfolded within spaces shaped by choices made long before. Yet the city was no longer static. Change, once resisted, now seemed inevitable. The future would bring new challenges and new divisions, but also new possibilities. The story of where the rich and poor lived in Victorian London became a lesson, a reminder of what happens when space is used to separate rather than support. As night settles over the city one last time in our story, imagine London at rest. Gas lamps dim. Footsteps fade. Houses of every kind grow quiet. Behind grand facades and crumbling walls alike, people sleep, carrying with them the weight of their histories and the promise of what tomorrow might bring. The streets that once divided now lie still, holding memories of struggle, endurance, and change. And as the city breathes in the quiet hours before dawn, it waits, always waiting, for the next chapter to begin. Good night. Welcome to our channel, where we explore forgotten corners of history in the calmest, slowest, and sleepiest way possible. Tonight, we begin a long journey into the shadows of Victorian London's darkest, where life of the poor was shaped by smoke, hunger, narrow alleys, and the unspoken rules of survival. This story will gently walk you through the hidden world behind the grand Victorian inn, the world beneath the gas lamps, beneath the wealth, beneath the noise of progress. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video to support our slow, relaxing storytelling. And tell us in the comments from which location you are watching this video. We love seeing you from around the world. The Victorian era, stretching from 1837 to 1901, is remembered for innovation, elegance, and empire. But behind the polished marble floors of wealthy homes lived an entirely different London, one of cramped lodgings, narrow alleys, soot-filled skies, and children sleeping under railway arches. This other London, hidden in fog and filth, was home to millions who fought every day simply to endure the next sunrise. Their voices rarely made it into, and their struggles were often overshadowed by the achievements of others. Yet it was their labor, their sweat, and their suffering that made the Victorian machine run. Tonight, in this quiet, slow journey, we begin uncovering what life was really like in forgotten. When people imagine Victorian London, they often see gas lamps glowing in gentle fog, elegant carriages rolling down wide boulevards, and men in top hats strolling past shop windows. But most people never experience it. The real heart of London was made up of overcrowded neighborhoods, where countless families squeezed into damp rooms, often sharing a single bed among several members. These rooms were inside tenements so poorly built that a heavy rain could seep through the roof and run down the walls like a small waterfall. The smell of rot, waste, and coal dust clung to everything: clothes, hair, skin, Families in the darkest corners of the city lived with the constant threat of eviction. Many landlords rented rooms by the day, not the week, meaning that losing even a few pennies could push a family onto the streets. Many poor Londoners wandered endless of shelter, going from lodging house to lodging, hoping to find the night. If a family managed to secure a spot inside, they often slept sitting up, resting against one another, unable to stretch out due to the overcrowding. The sound of coughing, crying infant, and restless snoring filled these spaces until morning. Step outside into the streets, and you would be met with a maze of alleys so narrow that two people could barely pass. The buildings rose high overhead, blocking out sunlight and trapping fog. These were streets where chimney soot floated in the air like dark snow, where gutters overflowed with filth, and where the only fresh water might come from a pump shared by hundreds. Most homes lacked plumbing, bathrooms, or even basic drainage. Human waste was often thrown into the street, landing with a thud before slowly making its way down uneven cobblestones toward the Thames. These conditions created a perfect home for disease. In the darkest Victorian streets, sickness was everywhere. Cholera outbreaks swept through neighborhoods in waves, claiming hundreds at a time. Typhus, tuberculosis, diphtheria, and scarlet fever spread through families with terrifying speed. A single infected child could pass the illness to siblings, parents, and even neighbors who shared the same air in overcrowded rooms. Death was such a constant presence that many children grew up understanding mortality before they understood their own birth. Yet, amid these grim realities, life continued. Street vendors filled the alleys each morning, calling out the names of their goods: fish, bread, coal, ribbons, buttons, anything that could be sold for a few pennies. The sound of footsteps on wet cobblestone mixed with the jingling of cartwheels and the clatter of milk pits. Children raced through the streets in packs, barefoot even in winter, dodging carriages and shouting to each other in accents so thick that outsiders struggled to understand them. These children, living without warmth or comfort, learned how to survive in ways that most adults today cannot imagine. Some scavenged the streets for scraps of metal or bone to sell to rag merchants. Others picked pockets, a desperate act that risked prison or beating. Many helped their parents carry loads of firewood, water, or coal across miles of roads. Childhood in the was not gentle. It was a race against hunger, cold, and yet children still found pockets of joy, playing marbles, splashing through puddles after rain, or gathering to listen to a street singer's voice, even for just a few minutes, made the world feel less heavy. As evening settled over Victorian London, the city transformed once again. Gas lamps cast long, trembling shadows against the brick walls. The fog thickened into something so dense that people compared it to smoke-filled rooms. In this dim light, the wealthy hurried home, but the poor began another battle, finding shelter, warmth, and safety. The darkness held danger: thieves, drunkards, gangs, the threat of violence. For many, nighttime was the hardest part of the day. Women often walked the streets, selling flowers, matches, or small goods to earn enough for bread. Some were forced into even more danger, risking their lives to survive one more day. Men gathered outside pubs, hoping to find a moment of relief in ale. Meanwhile, children curled up near factories where steam pipes reached warm air, or they huddled beneath bridges where the wind was less fierce. In these darkest streets, survival was a moment-by-moment effort. Despite all this, hope never completely disappeared. The poor of London created communities where people looked after one another. Neighbors shared food when they could, offered help during illness, and protected each other from danger. There was laughter too, at small jokes, at street performances, at the everyday absurdities of life. Even in the most desperate circumstances, people found ways to keep going. Tonight, as we drift through the first chapter of this story, we begin to understand that Victorian London was a city of contrast, beauty and misery, wealth and starvation, progress and suffering. The darkest streets were home to the resilience of ordinary people who learned to endure conditions that would break most of them. Their daily struggles reveal a world hidden beneath the polished surface of history. This is only the beginning of our long journey into Victorian London's shadows. In the next part, we will explore the lives of street work, criminals, police patrols, and the underground economy that shaped the survival of thousands. But for now, let the sounds of this world fade gently. Close your eyes. The night scenery of Victorian London's poorest district brought with it an atmosphere unlike anything seen in other parts of the city. While wealthier neighborhoods glowed with orderly lamps and clean walkways, the darker streets moved to a different rhythm, a slow, heavy pulse shaped by desperation. As the fog thickened, The narrow lanes became stage sets for the nightly dance of survival, one where every character had a role: the street hawker calling out his final prices, the pickpocket scanning for a distracted passerby, the constable pacing his beat, and the weary mother searching for a place to sleep with her children. This chapter of the story takes us deeper into lives, revealing the complex web of work, crime, danger, and endurance that defined the nightly world of the Victorian era. Street work was often the only way the poor could earn money, and the types of jobs available depended on age, strength, cunning, and opportunity. At sunrise, people sold food or coal. At sunset, their roles shifted. Gas lamps created just enough dim light to make streets useful, but not enough to reveal every perfect condition for quick trades and anonymous transactions. For many, the evening was a second chance to earn pennies they had failed to gather in. Men without steady work often turned to labor-intensive street jobs. Some became costermongers, selling fruit, vegetables, or fish from carts they sometimes rented by the hour. Their voices echoed down the alleys as they called out deep. Others carried heavy loads for small wages, acting as human delivery services in a world without accessible carts or affordable transportation. These men understood the streets intimately: the shortcuts, the busiest corners, the safest places to stand, and the locations to avoid once darkness settled. Women often faced far harsher. Many worked as washerwomen or seamstresses by day, earning pennies for long hours of exhausting. At night, they might walk the streets selling flowers, matches, ribbons, or small trinkets, items cheap enough for the poor to buy yet common enough to be sold again and again. Some women, trapped in endless cycles of poverty, had no choice but to accept more dangerous work. This was a reality rarely spoken about openly during the Victorian era, but known by all who lived in London's darker districts. The weight of survival forced many into perilous situations. Children, too, were part of the nighttime economy. Some acted as guides through fog, holding torches and leading wealthier individuals safely through confusing alleys. Others scavenged for bones, coal pieces, or metal fragments to sell at rag and shops. Some even performed simple songs or tricks, hoping that a passerby might spare a coin. These children lived on the edge of hunger each day, and even the smallest earnings meant warmth, bread, or the chance to avoid a beating for returning home empty-handed. Then there were those drawn into the underworld of crime, not because they wanted to, but because starvation left no alternative. Pickpockets worked in coordinated groups, each with assigned roles: the distractor, the taker, and the runner. Their movements were quick, subtle, and practiced. Thieves' dens scattered across poorer districts served as safe houses for criminal activity. Some gangs employed children because their small size allowed them to slip unnoticed into crowds or tight spaces. Many of these young thieves were their parents taken by disease or prison, leaving them stranded in the streets, no one to guide them. Police patrols in Victorian London were still evolving during this time. The Metropolitan Police, a relatively new institution in the mid-1800s, struggled to maintain order in districts so dense and confusing that even officers lost their bearings. Policemen walked their nightly beats with rattles or whistles for backup, and many encountered danger at every corner. Alleyways that seemed empty often held individuals desperate enough to fight or flee. Police faced the challenge of distinguishing between criminal actions and survival behaviors, a task made harder by widespread poverty. In many cases, officers ignored minor offenses, knowing that arresting someone over a loaf of bread or a pocket full of coal would do little to change their situation. The darker street Victorian London shaped an underground economy that operated with silent effect. Pawnbrokers flourished, offering the poor a way to trade anything: clothing, tools, heirloom, for tiny amounts of cash. Many families survived by pawning their belongings in the morning and reclaiming them at night if they earned enough to pay the interest. This daily back and forth created a fragile rhythm, one broken easily by illness or misfortune. Night shelter and lodging house were crucial survival, but conditions varied. Some were little more than rooms filled with benches where people slept, sitting upright. Others crammed dozens into single rooms for a few pennies. These spaces were loud, filled with coughing and murmured conversations. For many, a shelter meant at least temporary relief from the cold winds and damp fog that swept through London after sunset. Despite the filth, danger, and exhaustion that defined these neighborhoods, there was also a sense of community. Families shared food when possible. Neighbors watched out for one, and small acts of kindness created threads of. A mother might give a stranger's child half a crust of bread. A vendor might slip an extra vegetable into a loyal customer's basket. A group of children might share a blanket on cold nights. These moments of humanity softened the edges of a world otherwise shaped by struggle. As midnight passed, the streets grew quieter, factories slowed, pubs emptied, and fog thickened until lamps glowed like dim halos suspended. For many, this was the most vulnerable time. The cold deepened, hunger gnawed more sharply, and exhaustion heavily. Yet even then, sounds could be heard: the distant rumble of a carriage, the creak of a door, the cough of a child, the faint call of a vendor finishing his last round. By dawn, London's darkest streets prepared for another cycle. The poor who survived the night stepped into the pale morning light, ready to begin again. Their resilience, day after day, night after night, reveals a truth often overlooked. They were not weak, but incredibly strong, carrying the burdens of an unforgiving world with quiet determination. And so, this part of the story ends not with closure, but with a continuation. Because life in Victorian London's darkest streets was never still, never complete, always moving between survival and hope, shadow and light. The early morning hours in Victorian London's poorest districts brought no sense of calm or renewal, only a shifting of struggle from one form to another. As the last traces of night fog thinned, the city's millions awakened to another day shaped by routine hardship. The darkest streets, still damp from the night's mist, filled gradually with movement. Factory whistles began to howl, sending a rumble through the air that signaled the start of yet another long and unforgiving workday. In these overlooked corners of London, morning was not a quiet rise but a hurried scramble for survival, and each day mirrored the one before it with relentless repetition. Families crammed inside narrow lodging rooms woke first to the cold. Windows, if they existed at all, were often cracked or stuffed with rags to keep out drafts. Mothers stirred weak fires made from scraps of coal, attempting to warm a pot of. If there was no coal, the fire stayed cold, and breakfast became nothing more than a hope carried into the day. The sound of coughing children echoed the walls, the familiar, wheezing rhythm of a community constantly battling dampness. Outside, shopkeepers in wealthier districts prepared displays of bread, fruit, and polished goods. But in the poorer streets, vendors dealt mostly in remnant, bruised vegetables, stale loaves, cracked pottery, and anything that could be salvaged. People in these districts learned to stretch pennies beyond reason, buying the bruised apple instead of the full-priced one, the day-old roll instead of the fresh loaf, and second-hand sweaters that had already been worn down through several lives. By mid-morning, the streets teemed with workers hurrying toward factory. The clang of machinery had already begun long before they arrived. Inside textile mills, iron foundries, and match factories, the poor of London labored for hours under conditions that can only be described as oppressive. The air inside many factories was suffocating, thick with dust, fibers, chemicals, or smoke. Windows were kept shut to maintain proper temperatures for machinery, leaving workers to breathe whatever lingered in the air around them. Men lifted heavy loads, women tended to weaving frames or spinning machines, and children darted between rapidly moving belts and gears, clearing jams or fixing threads. Their small hands were valuable to factory not because of skill, but because they could reach into places where adult hands could not. Injuries were frequent, and fatalities, though tragic, were not rare enough to stop the machine. The factory system demanded endless endurance, and for the poor, refusing work was simply not an option. But not all poor Londoners worked in factories. Many sought day wages on the docks of the Thames, where ships from across the world unloaded crates of goods. Dock workers labored in freezing winds or blistering heat, often barefoot, loading and unloading cargo that could crush them with a single misstep. The docks were alive with activity. Sailors bargaining with traders, children running errands, and laborers shouting over the roar of carts and. Yet, even here, the poor found themselves at the mercy of foremen who hired only the strongest or quickest. A single bad day of health could mean no food that night. While men and children labored, many women worked as laundresses, scrubbers, or seamstresses. Laundresses spent long days boiling clothes, steaming tubs, their hands raw and cracked from constant to harsh soaps. Seamstresses, sitting in dim rooms, stitched clothing for hours on end, earning pennies for garments that sold for far more in fashionable districts. Those who worked from home often kept their children close, trying to teach them small tasks such as sorting threads or folding cloth. These children learned early that idleness meant hunger. Midday in the darkest streets carried a rhythm of its own. Vendors shouted prices, collision carts thundered past, and hawkers moved door to door selling anything from pins and candles to old newspapers and matches. The smell of roasting chestnut mingled with the unmistakable odors of refuse and damp timber. For those with a few coins, lunch might be a small meat pie or a roll with fat. For others, it was nothing more than water and whatever bits of bread they could afford. As noon gave way to afternoon, the resilience of the poor became even more visible. People gathered around street preachers, not always to hear sermons, but simply to stand in a crowd, to feel less alone. Children played in alleys, kicking stones or spinning hoops made from broken barrels. Their games were simple because they had nothing else. In many ways, their imaginations were the only luxury they possessed. The poor also relied on wealthier rarely. Women checked on sick neighbors, sharing herbs or homemade remedies. Older boys kept watch for police or gang members when younger children played. A loaf of bread shared among us meant more than just food. It meant community in its purest form. But beneath these moments of unity lay deep and constant insecurity. Working families lived in fear of sudden illness, injury, or unemployment. A single accident at the factory could leave a man unable to work, pushing the entire family into crisis. A mother's sickness meant children going hungry. Streets were filled with people who once had secure lives, but lost everything after one misfortune. The line between survival and collapse was razor thin. The afternoon also brought the dreaded rounds of the rent collector. Many tenements demanded daily or weekly payment. If a family failed to pay, eviction was swift and merciless. Belongings could be thrown into the street, leaving parents and children searching for anywhere at all, to sleep that night. Hospitals were costly, and many families avoided seeking medical care. As a result, diseases spread unchecked, and death took people in the prime of their youth. As the day wore on, fatigue weighed heavily on the poor. Yet there was little time to rest. Men and women who worked long shifts returned home only to find new tasks waiting: cooking, mending clothes, caring for children, fetching water, or searching for cheap wood to burn. For mothers, the work never truly ended. They combed lice from their children's hair, patched worn coats, and kept their home, no matter how small, clean enough to avoid sickness whenever possible. Then came the slow fading of afternoon light as London's skies turned gray once. Smoke from factories blended with fog, creating a thick, oppressive blanket that reduced visibility to mere feet. As children returned from running errands or small jobs, mothers counted their coins carefully, calculating whether they had enough for bread or some families gathered for whatever dinner they could manage. Others had nothing at all and went to bed hungry. Dusk marked a turning point, just as it did every day. For some, it meant returning home after long hours of backbreaking labor. For others, it was the beginning of night workers, cobblers, vendors, street sweepers, and those who hawked goods to pub goers prepared for another shift. Any income earned by night was precious. The poor could not afford the luxury of rest. In wealthier parts of London, families sat down to warm meals lit by lamps or candles, their homes filled with music or conversation. But in London's darkest streets, lamps were scarce, and the only light came from whatever made its way in through broken windows or cracks in the walls. The sounds that filled these poorer districts were different, too. Factory bells, distant whistles, crying infants, and the steady footsteps of those still searching for opportunity. As the first stars appeared, rarely visible through the city's smog, the poor prepared themselves for the coldest hours of the day. Blankets were thin. Beds were often shared among several people. Many slept in shifts or curled close to one another. Yet even in this exhaustion, the poor held on to small comfort. A softly hummed lullaby from a mother to her child, a whispered conversation between siblings, or a simple moment of stillness where the day's hardships faded briefly to quiet. This was the daily rhythm of Victorian London's darkest streets, a relentless cycle of labor, fear, hunger, and resilience. Part 3 reveals the structure of daytime life and the constant pressures that shaped every moment. But the night, still ahead in our journey, held its own complex world of danger, opportunity, and secret. Night in Victorian London's poorest districts carried a presence so heavy and distinct that anyone who walked those streets felt it settle around them like a damp cloak. The city's darkness was not just the absence of sunlight. It was a living thing shaped by fog, smoke, and the quiet fears of those who moved through it. As evening deepened, the world of the poor shifted once again. The exhausted workers who had spent all day in factories or markets returned to homes that offered little comfort. At the same time, a new cast of characters emerged into the night. Thieves, watchmen, night sellers, performers, gamblers, and children with nowhere else to go. Each carried their own woven into the nighttime fabric forgotten. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly, casting uneven patches of light that little the darkness. In wealthy neighborhoods, lamps were maintained regularly, cleaned and trimmed, so their glow remained steady. But in the poorest districts, the lamps were often dim, their glass cracked or so coated with soot that even when lit, they cast more shadow than light. For many Londoners, the winding alleys felt like endless, dark corridors, where even the sound of one's own footsteps was unsettling. The evening was when the poorest families gathered, trying to create small pockets of warmth and togetherness amidst the harsh Mothers prepared simple meals using whatever could be afforded. Stale bread, softened in broth, potatoes cooked over a tiny flame, or scraps of meat purchased cheaply because they were bruised or children sat close together, eager for any warmth the tiny fires provided. Their faces, smudged with soot and dirt, softened as they relaxed for brief moments, listening to the familiar sounds of their home, a kettle hiss, a floorboard creaking, a sibling's quiet laughter. But outside, the streets came alive in a different way. Shopkeepers who stayed open late lit hanging lamps or candles to attract customers. Markets transformed into nighttime bazaars, with vendors calling out prices to anyone passing by. Women sold flowers carried in small baskets. Men sold hot chestnut or pies, though some of these foods were of questionable safety. Desperation didn't leave space for caution. If something looked edible and the price was low, it was sold. The pubs filled quickly. For many working men, a cheap mug of ale offered the only escape from the gnawing fatigue of the day. The noise from pubs spilled into the streets. Laughter, shouting, singing, arguments. It created a strange contrast. Inside, boisterous energy. Outside, the lonely quiet of families returning home. Yet pubs were not just places of escape. They were meeting points where information traveled faster. News of jobs, illnesses, deaths, crimes, or opportunities was exchanged in low, tired voices. But, as with all places of public gathering, danger lurked in shadow. Drunken fights broke out often, and police did their best to intervene, though they were outnumbered and often hesitant to enter the most dangerous alleys. The poor had their own way of dealing with, sometimes stepping in to break up a fight, other times clearing out quickly to avoid trouble altogether. The night economy was complex and varied. Many people worked after sunset because daylight hours were already consumed by labor that didn't pay enough to survive. Night jobs filled the gaps. Charwomen cleaned shops and offices until their fingers ached. Boys carried lanterns for wealthy pedestrians who feared the dark alleys. Older children gathered around factory gates, hoping for small tasks like sweeping the floors or carrying bundles. But for others, nighttime work took darker. Prostitution was rampant, born from desperation rather than. Women of all ages, some barely older than children, wandered the foggy streets offering their company. Many had lost their families to prison or poverty. Others had been rejected by society or pushed into survival choices after their lives were marked by danger, illness, and deep vulnerability. Police rarely protected, and violence was a constant threat. They lived in the shadows of London's wealth, unseen except by those who sought them. Then there were the thieves, some seasoned adults, others frightened children with no other way to eat. Pickpockets moved through crowds with astonishing, slipping hands into coats and pockets. With practice, gangs recruited young boys and girls because they were small and quick. These children learned signals, codes, and escape routes. They learned how to run through alleys too narrow for police, how to hide in coal bins or under carts, how to disappear in fog as if swallowed by it. Crime wasn't a choice. It was often the last option available to those who had already lost everything else. Police patrols became more frequent at night, but the officers were limited, poorly equipped, poorly paid, and sometimes afraid themselves. Their rattles or whistles echoed through the streets when trouble arose. But backup was slow, and criminals knew how to evade them. The police faced resistance too, because many poor Londoners saw them as agents of the wealthy, rather than defenders of the vulnerable. Trust was scarce. Fear was plentiful. Meanwhile, lodging houses filled rapidly. Those who had managed to earn a few pennies could secure a place indoors. But the quality of that shelter varied widely. Some houses offered beds, thin, often infested with lice, but still better than the streets. Others offered a rope stretched across a room where people slept, slumped over it. The cheapest places offered only standing room or a corner of the floor, where dozens pressed shoulder to shoulder until morning. Those who had no pennies left wandered the city in search of warmth. Children huddled near bakery vents where warm air is. Homeless men gathered against the walls of factories where steam pipes leaked heat. Women with infants wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they had, trying to shield their babies from the biting night wind. London's streets at night offered countless horrors, but the cold was often deadly. Yet among all this hardship, London's poor displayed resilience that defies easy explanation. Families shared blankets with strangers. Mothers gave hungry children crusts of bread they desperately needed themselves. Older boys walked younger ones home, acting as protectors. People helped each other navigate danger not out of obligation, but out of an unspoken understanding. Survival required community as much as individual effort. Street musicians played soft tunes on violins or flutes, gathering small crowds who found a momentary escape in the music. Children danced, laughing in ways that seemed impossible given their circumstances. Storytellers recited tales of adventure, humor, or impossible dreams, each word drifting gently into the night air. These small moments of joy were precious because they reminded the poor that humanity still lived within them despite. As midnight passed, the darkest hours settled in. The city grew quieter. The fog thickened again, swallowing sound. The last vendors closed their stalls. Families curled up to sleep where they could, but London did not rest. Somewhere, a man stumbled home from the pub. Somewhere, a woman walked the streets in search of a client. Somewhere, a child searched for a warm place to hide. Somewhere, police chased shadows. Somewhere, a thief planned his next. The city breathed in slow, heavy rhythms, its pulse steady beneath the layers of misery and persistence. Night in London's poorest districts was a world of contradiction, danger and compassion, despair and hope, silence and survival. It was a landscape illuminated not by lamplight, but by the resilience of those who lived within it. These streets, though dark, held stories so powerful they continue to echo through. And as dawn approached once again, the entire cycle prepared to begin anew. As dawn crept over the rooftops of Victorian London, the first weak light pushed its way through layers of fog and chimneys, touching the narrow alleys and uneven cobblestones of the poorest. But morning in these places did not arrive with cheer or freshness. It crept in quietly, like a tired guest, bringing only the reminder that another day of struggle awaited. The night's cold still clung to the walls, and the shadows refused to lift fully. The poorest residents stirred slowly, their bodies stiff from restless sleep on hard beds or crowded floors, their minds already burdened with the challenges ahead. Inside cramped lodging rooms, families woke to the sound of coughing, a harsh, deep sound that echoed through hallways and drifted under thin wooden. Tuberculosis was so common that its presence felt like a constant companion. Children coughed in their sleep, adults coughed as they stood, and old men coughed until their breath rattled with exhaustion. For many, illness was not a brief interruption of life, but a permanent condition, woven into their routines as tightly as hunger or fatigue. Some tried to soothe their throats with warm water, but water itself often came from pumps shared by carrying risk contamination. Breakfast, if it existed at all, was simple and small. Mothers scraped the last crumbs of bread into bowls, pouring hot water over it to soften. Sometimes a sliver of cheese, bought cheaply the night before because it was nearly spoiled, would be divided into thin portions for children. Those who had nothing stirred empty pots, wishing for more, wishing for miracle. Hunger was not a dramatic force. It was a constant, dull ache that shaped decisions, moods, and movement. It made people slower, quieter, more cautious. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the morning brought activity. People emerged from their rooms and flowed into the streets, a slow river of humanity moving through alleys so narrow that shoulders brushed against damp brick walls. The streets were coated with mud, coal dust, and remnants of the previous day's garbage. Rag collectors pushed carts, picking through piles of refuse for anything, rags, bones, metal scraps, that could be sold. These rag and bone men played an important role in the economy of poverty. They bought what no one else wanted, giving pennies to those desperate enough to sell a broken shoe, a torn sleeve, or an animal bone left for discarded. Children joined the morning movement too, their faces still smudged with dirt from the previous day. Some carried baskets filled with flowers or matches, preparing to walk across the city to sell them. Others hurried to work in factory or sweatshops, their tiny feet learning to navigate slippery cobblestones. Many were barefoot, even in winter, the cold biting their toes until they went numb. But numbness was better than pain, and they learned to accept it as a normal part of life. For women, the morning hours brought an endless series of tasks. Those who worked as washerwomen dragged heavy buckets of water from pumps, then scrubbed clothing until their hands. The work was demanding and required strength, endurance, and patience. Steam filled the cramped rooms where they worked, making the air humid and difficult to breathe. Others stitched clothes for long hours at home, their backs hunched over small tables, their eyes strained by dim light. A few sold goods on the streets, pins, needles, ribbons, anything small enough to carry, but valuable enough to trade. The sound of machinery from nearby factories grew louder as morning progressed. The thumping and clinking beat like a mechanical heart through the district. Workers hurried inside before the doors closed, because latecomers were often docked pay or dismissed entirely. Inside, the air thickened with dust. Men swung hammers, women tended to spinning frames, and children darted between machines that towered over them like metal beams. Machines showed no mercy. Injuries were frequent, often life-altering. Fingers, hair, and clothing were caught in gears, and screams became just another sound absorbed in the constant roar. Outside the factory, street performers began their route, hoping to charm a few coins from passers-by. A man might balance on stilts, wobbling dramatically for attention. A woman might play a fiddle, her bow dancing across strings in rapid motion. Children gathered around these performers not only to watch, but to escape their own troubles, even if only for a moment. Their laughter, faint and fleeting, echoed down the alleyways like a reminder that even in the bleakest places, joy could still find a way. Meanwhile, in the darker corners of the district, a different type of criminal networks were active in places where law did not reach or chose not to. Pickpockets trained younger children with precision, teaching them how to slip hands into pockets unnoticed. Gangs organized operations to steal coal from storage yards or food from delivery carts. These activities were dangerous, but hunger sharpened the willingness to take risks. The alternative was starvation. Police presence increased during late morning hours, though patrols avoided some of the narrowest alleys of fear. Officers walked in pairs, keeping watch for disturbances. But many poor Londoners viewed them with suspicion and resentment. Laws often punished poverty itself, criminalizing homelessness. An officer could arrest a person simply for appearing idle or having no visible means of income. Mothers worried constantly their older children might get away under the accusation of a charge that could send them to reform schools or prisons. Charity groups, missions, and churches attempted to offer relief. Volunteers served small portions of soup, bread, or tea. They distributed old clothing, medical supplies, or blankets when available. But their resources were limited. For every one person, 10 more were turned away. The poor appreciated these moments of kindness, but they knew charity could not solve the deeper problem. It was a temporary patch on a wound that never fully healed. As the day continued, the streets became busier. Carts rolled past carrying barrels of fish, bales of cotton, or crates of coal. The smell of horse manure mixed with factory smoke, creating a dense aroma that clung to clothing and hair. Markets buzzed with conversation, buyers haggling, sellers shouting, children weaving between adults as they ran errands. The noise was constant, but strangely forming a backdrop of sound that brought people a sense of familiarity. This was their world, harsh but known, and knowing it was a form of comfort. In the midst of this activity, friendships formed and dissolved quickly. Neighbors who lived side by side often relied on one another for small acts of support. A mother might watch another's child while she worked. A man might help repair a neighbor's broken chair or door for a bit of bread. But tension sometimes brewed too. When resources were scarce, tempers flared. Fights broke out over borrowed coins, missing tools, or perceived slights. The stress of poverty compressed emotions like a coiled spring, tightening until it snapped. Despite these emotions, the rhythm of the day continued onward. Afternoon brought quieter moments. A child sleeping curled against a wall. An elderly man feeding pigeons with crumbs from breakfast. A group of women resting outside a washhouse and massaging their tired heads. These brief pauses were precious, glimmers of peace in a landscape defined by struggle. Later, as the sun began to lower, shadows grew longer, and the air cooled again. People rushed to finish errands before dusk. The fear of the night lingered in the minds of many. They knew the darkness brought new risks, not only crime, but exposure, especially in winter. Those who had enough money secured shelter early. Those who did not wander until they found a doorway, a bridge arch, or a set of warm vents to rest near. And yet, even with all this hardship, there was something remarkable about the poor of Victorian London. They lived with a determination that bordered on heroic. Their strength grew from necessity, their creativity from desperation, and their resilience from the knowledge that no one else would fight for them. They fought for themselves every single day, with their hands, with their wit, and as the afternoon haze settled over the poorest corners of Victorian London, the city shifted once more into slow, heavy rhythm. The factories continued to roar, but the streets outside took on a quieter, more reflective mood. People moved the kind of measured weariness, stepping carefully through puddles of soot-stained water, their bodies carrying the exhaustion of countless days. Children who had spent the morning selling goods or working in cramped rooms stole a few minutes to rest. Women rubbed their aching hands, stretching fingers stiff from sewing or scrubbing. Men stood near walls or railing, catching their breath before plunging back into the demands of survival. Late afternoon was a time when the divide between rich and poor became painfully clear. In wealthier districts, families prepared for dinner, carriages lined the streets, and polished windows glowed warmly from within. But here, in the labyrinth of alleys, the poor prepared for a night without guest. They hurried to finish what little business they could before dusk. They bought stale bread at discounted prices, knowing storekeepers sold off their least desirable goods just before closing. They bartered old clothing for vegetables or coal. Every exchange held weight, because every penny mattered. The sky dipped slowly, turning from a pale gray to deeper, smoky. Fog thickened around rooftops and chimneys, blurring the outline of the city. Victorian London's fog was infamous, not simply mist, but a heavy, choking blanket mixed with coal smoke and industrial fume. It dulled colors, softened shapes, and muted sounds so thoroughly that familiar streets became unrecognizable. Many people walked with hands outstretched, feeling their way through the air as much as the ground. But in this fog, the sounds of the city became distorted. A carriage wheel might echo as though coming from a distant hill rather than a nearby street. A child's cry could drift through the air and disappear before anyone found the source. The fog swallowed sound in strange ways, making the entire district feel isolated from the rest of it. And yet, in all this stillness, life continued, a determined, unstoppable way. Workhouses prepared for their evening admissions. These institutions, often considered the last resort for the desperate, were grim places where poor families sought shelter only when every other option had collapsed. People lined up outside the doors long before the overseer. Women clutched infants, men leaned heavily on canes, and children stared with blank expression, unsure of what awaited them inside. The workhouse routine was harsh. Families were separated, forced labor was required, and conditions were designed to discourage anyone from staying longer than absolutely necessary. But for some, even that harshness was preferable to the danger. For those who refused the workhouse, nighttime brought familiar struggles. Lodging houses filled quickly. Street corners became temporary meeting places where people exchanged stories, warnings, or bits of news. A mother might whisper to another about a cheap place to buy bread. A man might share information about a dockyard job. These conversations were spoken in hushed tones for fear of attracting unwanted attention. In poverty, even kindness had to be approached cautiously. As daylight faded completely, the poorest districts transformed. Gas lamps flickered to life, casting trembling halos of yellow around them. The contrast between light and shadow deepened, exaggerating the texture of broken walls, wooden doors, and uneven streets. The flicker of flame behind glass made the entire world seem alive and unstable, as if the streets themselves breathed with the same uncertainty as the people who lived in them. In this dim light, opportunists emerged. Thieves scanned for targets, drunken men stumbling home, street vendors distracted by customers, children carrying baskets looked heavy enough to contain something valuable. Crime was not always violent. It was often careful, quiet, and a hand slipping into a pocket, a basket lifted when a child wasn't looking, a coat tugged free from a railing. The poor stole from the poor as often as from the rich, because need was a force stronger than loyalty or morality. Meanwhile, police patrols made their rounds. Officers, carrying rattles or whistles, walked in pairs through the main street. They avoided certain alleys unless called, for the darkness hid too much and revealed too little. Their boots struck the cobblestones rhythmic, a steady sound meant to reassure but often ignore. Most residents had learned not to rely on the police for protection. The distance between authority and poverty was too great for trust to flourish. The night market formed as it always did, a loose collection of vendors, performers, and wanderers clustered around whatever pockets of light and sold flowers, lit by dim lamps, their petals softly. Men roasted chestnuts, small portable brazier, the warm scent drifting down the street. Children offered small matches in bundles, calling out softly, their voices barely rising above the hum of the night. The market was a place of survival, not luxury. It brought life to the streets, even if that life was fragile. Amid this movement, the sound of street musicians drifted through the fog. A fiddle played a slow, mournful. A tin whistle carried a melody that floated lightly before fading into the night. People gathered briefly to listen, finding solace in the music as much as in the company of others. For some, these small gatherings were the closest thing to joy they would experience that day. Inside cramped homes, families tried to create warmth. They burned scraps of wood, furniture pieces long past use, or even coal stolen from delivery carts. Every bit of warmth mattered. Mothers wrapped their children in thin blankets, whispering stories or singing lullabies. Fathers washed dirt from their hands and faces with cold water, preparing for another day of unpredictable work. Siblings huddled together, sharing whatever comfort their closeness provided. In these moments, the resilience of the poor revealed itself quietly. They found peace where they could. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in companionship, sometimes in the simple relief of being indoors. For the poorest children, though hardened by necessity, still drifted into sleep with dreams shaped by the stories they heard or the tiny adventures they experienced. But outside, the city never fully slept. Carriages continued to move through the wealthier district, their lanterns cutting through the fog. The clop of horses' hooves echoed faintly, a distant reminder of lives lived far from the misery of the slums. Street patrols continued until early morning, keeping watch as best they could, and the poor who had no shelter wandered through the streets, searching for warmth, led by instinct more than hope. As the hours stretched deeper into night, a strange quiet fell over the poorest neighborhood, a quiet not of peace but of exhaustion. Even the usual sounds softened, fewer voices, fewer footsteps, fewer cries. It felt as though the entire district was holding its breath, waiting for dawn to arrive and begin the cycle again. Victorian London's darkest existed within a world of their own, shaped by the harshness of poverty but strengthened by the persistence of the people who lived there. They endured night after night, holding on to whatever fragments of comfort they could. And though the world around them offered little in the way of mercy, they found ways to keep going. This resilience, this stubborn survival, is the unseen foundation of Victorian history. It is the story beneath the story, a story of millions whose names were never recorded, but whose lives shaped the true identity of London. The hours just before dawn were some of the most difficult in Victorian London's poorest district. The cold deepened, settling like a weight on the shoulders of those who wandered the streets without shelter. Chimney smoke from the previous day lingered low over the alleys, mixing with early morning fog in a dense haze made breathing uncomfortable. For the poor, these final hours of night tested one's endurance more than any other time. Fatigue pressed against the mind, hunger gnawed at the stomach, and the chill seeped into bones already worn down by long days and restless. Yet somehow, people continued to move, drifting through the maze like seeking warmth, work, or simply a place where the wind did not. Those who had managed to sleep, even on hard floors, crowded beds, or against rough brick walls, stirred slowly as pale light began to creep across the city. Inside lodging houses, bodies shifted, and groans echoed lightly as people tried to loosen stiff limbs. Mothers checked on their children, brushing away tangled hair and wiping soot from their faces with damp cloths. Men rubbed their eyes, preparing to search for another day's warmth was scarce, and fires had burned out hours earlier, leaving rooms cold enough to make people shiver even under blankets. Street sweepers emerged first, clearing refuse left from the previous day. Their brooms pushed along rotting vegetables, broken glass, scraps of paper, and coal dust. For these early workers, the city's filth was not a nuisance, it was a living. Some swept for the city, receiving meager wages, while others worked independently, offering their services for pennies. Their movements traced the outline of the streets, revealing the unspoken truth of Victorian life. The poor were the gears that kept the city running, even when no one noticed them. Before the sky fully brightened, market workers began preparing for the day. Butcher stalls opened early, displaying cuts of meat hung on hooks. Fish vendors arranged their catch on wooden boards covered in melting ice. Fruit sellers sorted apples and pears, separating the bruised pieces for cheaper sale later in the evening. The sounds of crates being unloaded, knives chopping, and vendors shouting greeting created a coarse kind of morning music, filling the air with a sense of urgency. Children woke to these sounds too. Many had slept in the same clothes they wore the day before, because owning sleepwear was a luxury. Some rubbed their arms to stay warm. Others began their day's work immediately, fetching water from pumps, collecting coal from the streets, or preparing goods to sell. Boys polished boots for pennies. Girls carried baskets filled with little items they hoped to trade or sell. The concept of childhood as a time of innocence simply did not exist for them. Life demanded their labor, and they adapted as best they could. The morning fog made everything appear softer, yet somehow heavier. Buildings loomed like dark shapes. Street lamps, still burning faintly, glowed like blurred orbs. People moved in and out of view like ghosts passing through a dream. The city's poorest inhabitants became silhouettes in motion, identities blurred by smoke, exhaustion, and the sheer scale of the struggle. Breakfast, if one could call it that, varied greatly depending on what the previous day had brought. A single loaf of bread might be divided among several family members. Tea, watered down almost to nothing, offered a semblance. Some families had only water to drink. Others chewed on leftover scraps saved before. But hunger was not something people talked about openly. It was simply understood that everyone lived. No one needed to ask if a neighbor was hungry. They always were. Despite the harsh reality, moments of humanity blossomed in small ways. A woman might offer a crumb of bread to a neighbor's child. A man might help an elderly resident walk safely through the fog. Children, though hardened by circumstance, often showed surprising tenderness, sharing marbles or bits of string or chalk, a single spark of play amid a world of work. Even these fleeting joys carried enormous weight, proving that poverty could not fully extinguish human warmth. The sun began to rise, casting longer shadows across the streets. The industrial heartbeat of London quickened. Factory whistles shrieked through the morning sky. Workers rushed to their station, moving in lines that resembled streams of ants flowing into towering buildings of brick and iron. Inside, machines roared to life, spinning, grinding, pounding with relentless force. The poor who entered these factories did so knowing that the next 12 to 16 hours would be filled with choking air, deafening noise, and constant danger. The city's wealthier residents moved in different rhythm. Carriages clattered over paved roads in the distance, carrying merchants, bankers, lawyers, and ladies dressed in fine clothing. Their world existed just beyond reach, a world of warmth, leisure, and choices. In contrast, the poor had none. Their lives were dictated not by ambition, but by necessity. The need for food, the need for warmth, the need to avoid illness. These needs formed the foundation of every action, every decision, every step taken through the fog-filled streets. As the morning grew clearer, the poorest neighborhoods revealed their full, stark reality. Tenement walls streaked with dampness, windows patched with cloth or paper, roofs sagging under the weight of constant rain, streets lined with puddles, each reflecting fragments of the gray sky above. The smells intensified as markets opened fully, fish mingling with coal smoke, refuse mixing with the sour scent of overcrowded homes. It created an atmosphere that clung to skin and clothing, a smell that marked the poor as clearly as any label or badge. Yet still, life continued. People adapted. They learned which vendors offered the best deal, which alleys to avoid, which constables to trust, and which neighbors could be counted on in times of sickness or need. The poorest parts of London may have appeared chaotic from the outside, but within them existed intricate systems of survival, patterns created not by law but by women gathered in small groups to discuss prices, illnesses, and rumors of charitable aid. Men exchanged information about potential jobs, work at the docks, temporary positions, constructions, deliveries needed across the children watched, hoping to hear news of tasks suitable to small hands. Every opportunity mattered. A few pennies could change the trajectory of a family, turning hunger into a meager meal or cold into momentary warmth. As noon approached, tension. The poor understood their vulnerability too well. Missing a day's wages could push a family into immediate crisis. Illness could sweep through a home and leave people too weak to work. Landlords made their rounds, demanding. Some tenants offered coins, others offered pleading looks, and some simply avoided answering the door. Yet, no matter what, Eviction hovered like a silent threat. The poor lived one decision away from disaster. The afternoon brought a different kind of soul. The heat inside factories grew unbearable. Outdoor laborers wiped sweat from their brows despite the cool air. Market vendors grew hoarse from shouting. Children felt fatigue tug at them, but rest was a rare luxury. The poor worked until they could no longer stand, and even then, they often continued a little longer, because stopping meant losing wages, and losing wages meant going hungry. And so, the endless cycle of survival continued. Morning faded into afternoon, and afternoon would soon slip into evening, bringing with it the dangers and mysteries of the night. The story of Victorian London's darkest streets was not a story of it was a story of repetition, of endurance stretched to its limits, of hope flickering faintly, of hardship. The evening light softened once more across Victorian London's poorest district, casting long shadows over rooftops and narrow passages. As the day thinned into twilight, the city exhaled a weary sigh, its breath a mixture of coal smoke, damp fog, and the lingering sense of markets shutting their stalls. The poorest Londoner, those who had lived every hour of this day with a quiet determination, prepared themselves for yet another transition into the uncertain world of night. But tonight, in this final chapter, we walk with them a little deeper, reflecting not just on their struggle, but on the world that the glimpses of hope they carried, and the echoes they left behind. By evening, exhaustion hung heavy, and factory workers filed out of buildings, their faces smudged, their shoulders slumped. Their pockets held only a handful of coins, barely enough for bread, coal, or rent. Some stopped at pubs for a moment of warmth, hoping the glow of lanterns would ease the ache, and others hurried home to families waiting in cold rooms, hoping for news of steady work, even if only for a day. The rhythm of the poor was steady and unchanging. Rise, labor, endure, repeat. As night truly began to settle, gas lamps flickered to life again, small islands of trembling light in a sea of shadow. Their glow illuminated the edges of worn cobblestones and revealed glimpses of the life lived beneath London's grand facade. Children moved through these dim patches, some helping their families gather wood or water, others selling the last of their matches or flowers in hopes of earning a single extra penny before bedtime. Their small hands and tired eyes reflected a childhood shaped entirely by necessity, not by choice. Mothers, weary from their own, returned home to tend to children, cook simple meals, and mend torn clothing by candlelight. Many whispered stories to their little ones, stories of a better future, stories of angels and adventure, stories that carried warmth into coldest corners of their lives. These quiet moments were among the few comforts the poor consistently held on to. Even when food was scarce and illness lingered in the air, storytelling gave families a sense of connection, of hope, of belonging. Men finished their work and sought out additional tasks in the night market. They unloaded carts, carried crates to storage rooms, or swept the floors of shops preparing to close. Night work paid little, but a few pennies earned after sunset could mean extra coal for the fire, or a thicker slice of bread for the children. The poorest families often survived thanks to these late hours when fatigue pressed heavily on the body, yet necessity pushed them to continue. And once the final markets closed, another London entirely. A London of silence, of shadows, of invisible struggle. Some wandered the streets looking for shelter. Those who could not afford a bed in a lodging house searched for warm vents or doorways shielded from the wind. Children curled up beside their siblings, stairways or beneath carts, huddling together for warmth. Their bodies shook as the night grew colder, but sleep eventually claimed them, even if it came with dreams shaped by hunger and fear. Yet even in these darkest hours, a strange sense of unity lingered. Neighbors looked after one another, sharing scraps of food, blankets, or news of charitable meals. A woman might check on an elderly friend living alone. A man might offer guidance to a lost child. These small acts of kindness threaded their way through the hardship, faint but persistent of light. The night also brought reflection. Those who had a few moments of stillness found themselves thinking about the lives, the obstacles they faced, and the dreams they carried despite everything. Many dreamed of steady work, warm homes, full meals, and safety for their children. Some dreamed of leaving London entirely, imagining a countryside untouched by smog and noise. Others dreamed only of peace, a day without hunger or illness. These dreams sustained them quietly, like embers glowing beneath ashes. As the night deepened, the fog thickened more. It drifted across rooftops and poured down alleys, a living gas lamps dimmed even further, their light swallowed by the mist. The city fell into an uneasy sleep, interrupted only by distant sounds, the rumble of a carriage wheel, the cry of a hungry infant, the soft steps of a constable in his rounds. In this stillness, the sheer weight of life in the darkest Victorian streets became unmistakable. Poverty shaped every breath, every step, every thought. It was not an occasional hardship. It was a full, unrelenting, and yet, the people who lived in this world did so with remarkable resilience. They endured conditions that would terrify most of us today. They adapted, supported one another, and created meaning out of the smallest joys. Their strength was not loud or celebrated. It was quiet, steady, and often ill. But without them, without the millions who labored, suffered, hoped, and survived, Victorian London, as we know it, could not have existed. The wealth of the city was built on their backs, their hands, and their sacrifices. As dawn approached once again, the cycle prepared to repeat. The morning would bring factory with crowded markets, hurried footsteps, and another day of survival. Nothing would change, and yet everything persisted, because that was the nature of life in Victorian London's darkest, a continuous, unbroken pattern of struggle, endurance, and fleeting moments of tenderness. Tonight, as we close this final chapter, we remember the countless unnamed individuals who lived these, not in books, but in reality. Their days were filled with hardship, yes, but also with humanity, courage, and quiet hope. They left behind no grand monument, no celebrated legacy, but their lives shaped the world in ways history rarely acknowledges. And in remembering them, even in this calm, slow, bedtime retelling, we honor their strength. Thank you for listening to this long journey through the shadows and struggles in London. As you rest now, let the echoes of their resilience settle gently in your thoughts, reminding you that even in the darkest places, people have always found ways to care and to hope. Good night.